I'm so tired. And I'm not tired from all the testing. I'm just tired of trying to find positive spins to put on things. That, hey, AMD threw us a crumb. All right, so this is obviously the 9850X3D launch embargo lift. Obviously, if you couldn't tell by your inbox or your subscription feed, everyone's embargo lift is lifting at the same time. So the 9850X3D, for all intents and purposes, is the same exact CPU as a 9800X3D. It is just 400 megahertz faster in its boost clock. This is just, in my opinion, the process improvement that we've seen over the last year or so since the 9800X3D's launch. I guess it's been less than a year, but still, since its launch, I've gotten some process improvement, which is about the only positive spin I can really put on this CPU is the fact that it's 400 megahertz faster, it's the same TDP, it's the same power draw, it's the same thermals. In fact, I didn't even go through all of the frame time testing and all that sort of stuff because of the fact that it is exactly the same processor with the dial turned up just a little bit. Now, what's kind of funny about that though, as we know, the 9800X3D was already just given the smackdown when it comes to Intel at the 5.2 gigahertz boost that the 9800X3D had. So for funsies, I put the 14900K in this test at the 253 watt profile just to see how it compares. Mostly the same CPU bench test suite that we use. It's not as full as I'd like it to be, but we just haven't had time to really go through and kind of revamp the testing. So this at least is giving us some data, but here's the thing, it's not like it's a new CPU family, it's not like it's a new architecture or anything like that. It's literally a little bit more of the same thing. And that's why I went into that little bit of a tangent in the beginning saying, hey, at least they threw us a crumb, because although there have been more Radeon users than the past, although AMD's really only dropped what, 2 or 3 GPUs in the last year. They've said they're pulling out of the high-end GPU market. They've come out, obviously, with the 9000 series CPUs, but remember, that started back in 2024. And 2025, they gave us the 9950X3D, then the rumored 9950X3D X2, which I guess actually has now been sort of confirmed based on filings of theirs. But anyway, I digress. They've taken all this Ryzen market share and rolled that income into AI. So, you know how Jensen said that GeForce is the house, or AI is the house that GeForce built? Basically saying gamers who bought into the NVIDIA GeForce, architecture, basically thanks for your money, we're now gonna go over here now. AMD's doing the same thing, okay? This is just a crumb that they're throwing to kind of sort of keep some relevance out there when it comes to what's kind of stagnant right now regarding CPUs, to be honest. Nothing really exciting here to talk about. Now, I do have a new test on here. It's 3D Mark CPU profile. It's the first time I've really used this test, but it's kind of neat because it actually does different thread testing. So for that test, I did single thread, I did 8 thread, 16 thread, and max thread. So it's kind of interesting where obviously the 14900K being a 24 thread CPU goes up to 24, whereas the 9800X3D is gonna stop at 16. But before we get there, it's going to talk about the obligatory Cinebench R23. The 9800X3D got a 22,136 average, versus the 9850X3D's 23,821. So that's about 1,700 points higher, which makes sense. It's 400 megahertz. I mean, that test scales really well with frequency. So yeah, it scales obviously pretty well. But the thing is, big point spreads on Cinebench don't necessarily equate to like a gaming performance uplift. And I'm gonna say this is still an unpopular opinion for a lot of people. I do not find the 9800X3D to be the GOAT CPU overall. It's obviously the gaming GOAT, but I think you give up a lot for 8-core 16 thread if you're doing things like video rendering, or you're doing any sort of encoding, or you're doing anything that's heavily multi-threaded. 16 threads is kind of like the bare minimum these days. I mean, 32 thread CPUs in desktop, standard desktop configurations now are just absolutely stomping all over this thing because it's double the threads, and almost all software these days is heavily multi-threaded. So I feel like you give up having the brute force of CPU, if you will, to have a single CCD with X3D Vcache on it, which is allowing for amazing frame rates when it comes to games. But you have to give up a lot to do that, in my opinion. And it's still expensive. It's still $500 for a CPU. The Intel 14900K at 253 watt, having way more threads, it's no surprise. Obviously, in Cinebench R23 just destroys the 9800X3D at 38,011. But again, that also doesn't necessarily equate to gaming performance because, as you know, the Intel is going to get destroyed by these CPUs in games. Anyway, moving on, Cinebench R23 single thread, 9800 got a 2024, 9850 got a 2263, 400 megahertz uplift definitely shows in single threaded, and it was boosting and holding at 5.6 gigahertz. I want to point that out. The 9800 X3D was hitting 5.2 and sometimes 5.225. You're getting like an extra 25 megahertz in there sometimes. PBO was not on, but you're getting 5.6 all day, every day, even in all core on the 9850 X3D, which is kind of nice to see. And then the 14900K single thread actually beats both at 2343, but again, that's because it was boosting all the way up to 5.8, 5.9, which definitely shows in that particular test. But it's synthetic, kind of take that with a grain of salt. Geekbench, single thread on the 9800, 3239 versus a 3533, and then the Intel got beat in single thread in Geekbench with a 3222. But once you look at the all-core, you got 18367 for 9800, 19387 for the 9850, and a 20,999. Couldn't get that one extra point to make it 21,000. Remember, this is an average, by the way. Close, anyway. Blender, again, these are samples. You can see right here on the chart, 150.137 versus 162.397 versus 237.17 for Monster. Higher samples is better in this particular chart. We look at Junk Shop, same story, 101.789 versus 111.781 versus 162.344. This is where Intel really shows its encoder capabilities. It's a very good CPU when it comes to like Premiere and stuff like that. It's the reason why a lot of people use Intel-based systems when they're dealing with the Adobe suite. It just really works well in a lot of these types of workflows. Classroom, 78.664 versus 83.82 versus 119.66. Now this is where I talked about CPU profile in 3D Mark. It's just another type of CPU test. But you can see right here, 9800 got a 1210 in one thread versus 1297 versus 1283. So the Intel kind of falls in between the two. We look at 8 thread. So again, the Intel is in parity all the way up until past 16 threads here. So we have an 8150 versus an 8974 versus an 8952. So again, right in the middle. So this is where it's kind of interesting because you would think because the Intel CPU thread for thread having a higher boost clock would actually handedly beat the 9850 and 9800 X3D, but it's kind of not. It really depends on the workflow, honestly. But when we look at the 16 threads, that's where it starts to pull ahead. So we got a 10,168 versus a 10,437 versus an 11,767. And then obviously, when we look at the max threads, those numbers are the same for the AMD CPUs, but then the Intel jumps out to a 15,831. Okay, that's just CPU synthetics. That doesn't mean anything. So let's talk about gaming here, and this is where it kind of starts to get funny. Let's go ahead and start with, again, synthetics. We'll look at Speedway, which is a ray trace test. Yeah, so we got for the 9800 X3D, a 14,409. 9850 X3D, you're gonna see on our charts, sometimes scores a little higher than the 9800 X3D, and sometimes scores a little less than the 9800 X3D. And we'll talk about why I think that is in a second after spending many, many hours with these CPUs right now. But a 14,390 for the 9850 X3D, so it was 19 points lower, which when you're talking about 14,000 points, this is a fraction of a percent. It's run variance, even though these are averaged runs, still. And then the Intel at 14,368. So I actually thought in Speedway the Intel might have done better, but no, it didn't. If we go and take a look now at Times by Extreme, which is just an older DirectX type of test, if we look at the scores here, this is where Intel actually lost. So the 9800 X3D got a 25,485, 9850 edged it out by 12 points at a 25,497 versus Intel's 25,152. So it's about 340 points lower on the Intel. Again, synthetic 300 points at 25,000 range is completely indiscernible to the human eye. You cannot tell a difference whatsoever because we're talking like a tenth of a frame average difference between the CPUs. But what happens now when we start moving into actual titles, not 3D Mark stuff? So let's start with Black Myth Wukong. Now here's where we changed the methodology a little bit. Everyone loves to test the CPUs at 1080p, medium or low settings to initiate a bottleneck and see which CPU can push it farther. I'm running an experiment this time to see if you guys are happy by actually running it with the exact same settings we run our GPU testing methodology with. So what that means is 4K and 1440p, as well as 1080p, but these are anywhere between high to very high to ultra settings. So we're trying to, in a realistic type of scenario with our 5090, because again, we do want to test the CPU to see how it can handle high frame rates. That's where the bottleneck and the difference is really gonna show. We use a 5090 FE with an aggressive fan curve and a max power limit to make sure we're pushing as many frames as possible, but in our testing methodology of our GPU test rig to see what happens in gaming here. In 4K in Black Myth Wukong, we have the 9850X3D at 84.1, the 9800X3D at 83.3, and the 14900K at 82.3. We have a range of 2 FPS average between Intel and the 9850X3D at 4K. That shouldn't surprise too many people. As we go down in resolution, we should see the gap start to widen. So we have the 9850X3D at 121 even FPS. Now pay attention to the 1% lows here too. That's where you'll see that the 3D Vcache really does start to kind of show itself as well once we get out of the synthetic GPU benchmarks and we move into the actual game engines. The 9850X3D has 121 average and a 100 even on the 1% low. 9800X3D is a 120.9, so 0.1 FPS difference. 98.8, so it's actually 1.2 FPS difference on the 1% low. And then the Intel actually won this one at 122.1 FPS. So again, it's a 1.1 FPS difference, which is less than a percent difference between the highest and lowest on this chart. But the 1% low is even better at 101.3. Once we move over to 1080, you'll see here, they are all pretty much exactly within range of each other. The Intel actually wins in average FPS by what? 0.8 FPS, a 151.5 for the 9850 versus a 152.8 for the 14900K. But it actually loses in the 1% lows. And that's where I said you'll start to see with the 3D Vcache as we move across these charts, really starts to show its benefit in gaming. Obviously we had a 126.1 for the 9850 and a 122.3 for the 149, so a 4 FPS difference average for the 1% lows. Again, when you're talking about 150 FPS, 122 in the 1% lows, you're not gonna notice 4 FPS fluctuation. But as we move along into higher FPS games, you're gonna notice quite a bit change here. So let's take a look at F1. F1 carries a lot of high frame rate. So in 4K, pretty even across the board. 153.2 versus a 150.2 versus a 154. So the Intel actually won by 0.8 FPS on the 4K average, but lost in the 1% lows by just under 2 FPS. Moving over to 1440p, you can see this is where the gap really starts to show. And I noticed something very weird on F1. In fact, we are very behind on filming this video today because I actually spent more than an hour troubleshooting just this one resolution. Because you'll see as we go to 1080p, I'm not getting a performance increase between 1440 and 1080p with the 14900K, no matter what the settings are. I've verified all the settings, I've verified all the files, I've verified our drivers, I've verified that everything is actually sticking. But it's like it hit this hard wall where 1440p and 1080p are essentially the same numbers. And that was driving me absolutely insane, and I had to verify and validate that these numbers are accurate, and they are. I don't know why this particular title for the 14.9 and 1080p is no faster than 1440p, but obviously the AMD system had no problem. So 1440p, 9850X3D at a 251.9 versus the 9800's 250.5. You can see their 1% lows are within less than 1 FPS of each other. But the Intel was all the way down to 222.1 for the average and 142.4 for the 1% low. So now we're talking a 20 FPS difference on the 1% lows between Intel and AMD, and that's where it's really gonna start to show. But when we look at the 1080p numbers, you'll see what I mean. Like the AMD system jumped well over 300 FPS, right? 307.2 versus 306.3, but 227.8, we gained what, 6 FPS for the Intel system, and no amount of troubleshooting and revalidating settings and restarts and making sure that things are truly applying and no rogue settings change themselves. That's just the way the numbers landed. So I don't know what the deal is with that title. It's a potential outlier, but it is what it is. All right, moving on. let's go ahead and take a look at Borderlands 3. That's a title that it's older, but it's also a high FPS title. We like it when it comes to CPU testing because of the fact that it pushes so many frames. 178.4 for the 9850 versus 177.9 versus 9800 and 173.2 for the 14900K average. So it's really close on the average, but it's 20 FPS lower on the 1% lows. So you can see 153.4 versus 153.6 versus 133.6. So 20 FPS again at 4K. It's not a great sign if it's that far apart in 4K, because as soon as you initiate 1440p, the gap starts to widen here. So the 9850 X3D actually lost to the 9800 by just under 2 FPS. Again, we're just under 300 FPS here, so it's not like you're gonna notice that. Again, these are just complete run variances. But take a look at this. 264.5 average for the 14.9, so about 25 FPS, 20 to 25 FPS lower on the average. But look at the 1% lows. 50 FPS difference on the average 1% low. 186.8 versus 232. 3D V-Cache may not necessarily in the higher resolutions give you a bigger gap in the average, but that much higher 1% low is perceived smoothness that is going to be noticeable versus the average. So that's why the 9800 X3D, 7800 X3D, and any of the X3D CPUs have always been GOAT because of what the 3D V-Cache is capable of doing. But stop me if you've heard this before, because it's really the same CPU. Anyway, moving on, if we look at 1080p, now we're at like 60 FPS difference, right? 371 for the 9850 versus 312 for the 14.9. And we're also at almost 70 FPS difference on the 1% low, 280.8 versus 218.7. All right, so let's go and talk about Cyberpunk, our last benchmark on here before we get out of here. There's not a whole lot to really talk about. Cyberpunk is an interesting title for us still, Phantom Liberty, because it does take a lot of CPU because there's so much world rendering happening here. In 4K, it's fairly a wash. 9850 got a 60.1, 9800 got a 61.1, so the 9800 was 1 FPS higher. And then the 14900K at 59.1. So again, we had a total of 2 FPS difference between the highest and lowest. 1% lows, same sort of story. They're actually pretty damn close. Move up to 1440p. This is where we start to notice a little bit of a gap. 119.9 for the 9850 versus 117.5 for the 14.9. 119.4 for the 9800, it's only a half FPS difference. 1% lows are pretty much even across the board. 97.2 versus 98.7 versus 98.4. 1080p though, that head limit of the Intel really shows its ugly head. 9850 at 170.0, 9800 at 171.2. So for whatever reason, even though the chipset drivers were all updated and everything for this CPU, just ever like a fraction of a percent higher on the 9800 versus the 9850. It's possible the 9850 may not have just been seeing as much of a load, so it may not have been clocking to 5.6 all the time. Because remember, not all cores are gonna do that when you're playing a game. It's gonna bounce around to the preferred cores. But again, 400 megahertz in Cyberpunk, I don't think will make a huge difference because of the fact that Cyberpunk is still, because we don't run any upscaler, we don't run any frame gen or anything like that, or DLSS, none of that. It is all GPU bound. Anyway, 170.0 for the 9850 versus 171.2 for the 9800 versus 132 for the 14900K and 1080p. So a 40 FPS difference there. And then 21 FPS difference on the 1% lows of 130.0 versus a 109.5. This was a very long video to say 400 megahertz makes a little bit of a difference. Now here's the thing, it costs $20 more on average, well about $30 more, because right now I checked pricing as of right now, this video going live, January 28th is when you guys are seeing this video. You can get the 9800 X3D for $469 on Amazon. You can get the 14900K for $468.98 on Amazon, so it's $1.01 cheaper. And the MSRP for the 9850 X3D is $499. So here's obviously no one that owns a 9800 X3D or potentially even a 7800 X3D is gonna run out and buy a 9850 X3D. You are not their customer. I know there's gonna be a lot of people who are like, this is so stupid. Why would I get rid of my 9800X3D for a 9850? You wouldn't and you shouldn't. It's not for you. It's for the person that doesn't have the CPU or the platform yet and is looking to buy something. If you want to get the absolute, like, squeeze every juice you can out of your CPU and your frames, squeeze all the drops of juice out of it, you would want a 9850X3D if you can swing the $20 to $30 more. Here's the reality though. If you live near a micro center, you can get the 9800X3D for even cheaper than $469. We've seen it go as low as, like, with the bundle making the CPU something like $399. So that, for me personally, I would take the chance that my 9800X3D would overclock to 9850X3D numbers, because remember they are overclockable, and save the money, personally. Now, one thing I didn't test was PBO or any sort of manual overclocking. I'm gonna do that in a separate video, because my 9800X3D, it's on my test bench, even though I have other CPU, I have other 9800X3Ds since we built that. That is the CPU we have done all of our GPU benchmarks with. That CPU has to stay on my test bench. It is a dud of an overclocker. It will not go higher than 5.3 gigahertz all core, which is what we do. We lock, not for this test. This test, it was allowed to boost and do whatever it wants. But for our GPU testing, we lock that sucker down. Voltage is locked, fans are cranked to 100%, and the clock speed and the multiplier is locked at 53, 5.3. 5.35 crashes. 5.4 is a pipe dream. Now, I've seen people all over the internet saying they've gotten their 9800X3Ds to go 5.5, 5.6, 5.7. No problem. You're already now past technically a 9850X3D, which if your CPU can do that, congratulations. You have a 9850X3D, which is exactly what they did by just doing it at the factory. Okay, that's all this is. There's nothing special about it. It's not like it's a different process. It's not like it's anything special. It's just a improved binned process. That's all it is. Ours doesn't do that. Well, Jay, why don't you just take out your a different CPU and see if it'll overclock? Well, if I did that, I'd have to redo every single GPU test again, which we're gonna have to do eventually someday, but not today. So anyway, we'll do another video to see what kind of headroom there is in the 9850X3D. I'm curious as to whether or not they've already squeezed every bit of it out. Like if there's any overclocking headroom available to it. Because like I said, our 9800X3D is the first one we got, which was the very first sample when it very first launched. And ours just absolutely had nothing in it above 100 megahertz overclock. That's it. All right, guys, there you go. I guess we should feel lucky that AMD dropped something that's consumer-based, considering everyone else just kind of seems to be saying, fuck the consumer. We just want to sell everything to AI data centers. Thanks, AMD.